My name is Stella, I'm 26 years old, and if someone had told me a year ago that my husband would one day walk into our home with another woman beside him while I stood there completely unaware that my marriage was already falling apart, I probably would laughed in disbelief because back then, I truly believed Daniel loved me enough never to hurt me that way. When people looked at us from the outside, honestly we seemed like the perfect couple. We had been married for 3 years, lived in a small but beautiful apartment near the city. Although we argued sometimes like every normal couple does, I never imagined there would come a day when I would look at the man I loved and feel like I no longer recognized him. I met Daniel when I was 21 years old during my final year at the university. He was charming in a quiet kind of way, the type of man who listened and remembered every details about you without trying too hard. The first thing I noticed about him was his patience. He never interrupted people. He never tried to be the loudest person in the room. Being around him felt calm, and at that point of my life, calm was exactly what I needed. We started dating a few months later, and honestly, those first 2 years were some of the happiest moments of my life. We used to take long walks late at night talking about our future, our dream house, the children we wanted someday, the places we hoped to travel together. Daniel always made me feel safe, and when he proposed to me on a rainy evening outside my favorite cafe, I said yes before he could even finish asking the question. I really believed I was marrying the love of my life. The first year of our marriage felt normal and peaceful. We struggled financially sometimes because Daniel was still building his career, but we supported each other through everything. I worked at a publishing company while he worked long hours at an architecture firm, and although we were often tired, we still made time for each other. We cooked dinner together, watched movies late at night, and spent weekends talking about all the things we wanted to achieve together in the future. Then slowly, things began changing in ways I didn't fully notice. It started with little things. Daniel became quieter around me. He spent more time on his phone and less time talking during dinner. Sometimes I would tell him stories about my day, and halfway through the conversation I would realize he wasn't even listening anymore. At first, I blamed stress. His company has started handling larger projects, and he often came home exhausted. I tried to be understanding because relationships go through difficult periods sometimes, and I didn't want to become the kind of wife who complained about every small change. But eventually the distance between us became impossible to ignore. There were nights when Daniel would come home, kiss my forehead absent-mindedly and immediately disappear into the shower without saying more than a few words to me. Sometimes he stayed awake texting people long after midnight while lying beside me in bed, and whenever I asked who he was talking to, he answered so quickly that it almost sounded rehearsed. Just work stuff. I wanted to believe him. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. One Friday evening, I spent almost 3 hours cooking his favorite meal because he had been stressed all week and I wanted to surprise him. I lit candles on the dining table, changed into a dress he once told me he loved and waited for him to come home feeling strangely excited about finally spending time together again. Daniel arrived almost 2 hours late. By then the food was cold. The candles had nearly melted completely. I still remember the way he walked into the apartment that night because something about him felt different immediately. Distant. Like his mind was somewhere else entirely. "I'm sorry," he said quickly loosening his tie. "Work was crazy." I forced a smile even though disappointment sat heavily in my chest. "It's okay. I made dinner." He glanced at the table briefly before sighing tiredly. "I already ate with some clients." That sentence hurt more than it should have. I remember standing there staring at the untouched food while he walked past me towards the bedroom, completely unaware that I was trying very hard not to cry over something that seemed so small. Things only became worse after that. Daniel stopped touching me the way he used to. Our conversations became shorter. Sometimes entire days passed without any real connection between us at all. I started feeling lonely inside my own marriage, and honestly that kind of loneliness hurts differently because the person making you feel alone is sleeping right beside you every night. One evening, my best friend Sophie visited me after work, and halfway into our conversation she suddenly looked at me carefully and asked, "Are you okay?" I laughed awkwardly and said yes immediately, but she didn't look convinced. "You seem sad lately," she said gently. I tried brushing it off, but eventually the truth spilled out of me before I could stop it. "I think Daniel is changing." Sophie stayed quiet for a moment. Before asking the question I had secretly been avoiding myself. "Do you think there's someone else?" I answered too quickly. "No." But even as I said the word, fear settled heavily in my stomach. Because deep down, I had already started wondering the same thing. A few weeks later, Daniel started mentioning a woman from work named Vanessa. At first it sounded harmless. "She's helping manage the new project." Vanessa stayed late at the office too. "Vanessa thinks the client will reject the proposal." Her name appeared constantly in casual conversation until eventually I started noticing how differently he spoke whenever he mentioned her. There was energy in his voice again. Interest. Attention. Things he no longer gave to me. I hated myself for becoming suspicious, but I couldn't help it. On night Daniel fell asleep on the couch while working on his laptop, and his phone kept vibrating beside him repeatedly. I tried ignoring it at first because I wasn't the type of woman who checked her husband's messages, but after the fourth notification, curiosity defeated me. I looked at the screen. And my entire body went cold. The message simply said, "I already miss you." My chest tightened painfully. The sender's name was Vanessa. I stared at the message for what felt like forever while my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. I wanted to wake him immediately. I wanted to scream. Cry. Throw the phone across the room. But instead, I quietly placed it back beside him and walked into the bathroom before he could see the tears already filling my eyes. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying every strange moment from the past few months inside my head, and suddenly everything started making horrible sense. The distance. The late nights. The emotional coldness. The constant texting. I wanted desperately to believe there was an explanation, but deep down, women usually know when something is wrong before they admit it to themselves. The next morning, I confronted him. At first Daniel denied everything. "She's just a coworker. You're overthinking. It's not what you think." But his face gave him away before his words did. Finally, after almost an hour of arguing, he admitted the truth. He had feeling for her. I still remember the exact moments those words left his mouth because it honestly felt like someone had physically punched me in the chest. I couldn't breathe properly. I just stared at him while tears rolled down my face. Waiting for him to say it was a mistake. Waiting for him to tell me he loved me and wanted to fix our marriage. Instead, he stayed silent. And somehow that silence hurt even more than the confession itself. For weeks after that conversation, we barely spoke unless necessary, and every interaction felt heavy with anger, sadness, and disappointment. Part of me hoped he would eventually come back to me emotionally once whatever confusion he was feeling disappeared. But I was wrong. 3 months later, the moment that completely destroyed our marriage finally happened. It was a cold Tuesday evening and I had just returned home from work when I heard the keys turning in the front door. I assumed Daniel had come home early for once, so I walked into the living room expecting nothing unusual. But then the door opened. And Daniel walked inside with another woman standing beside him. Vanessa. For a few seconds, my brain genuinely failed to process what I was seeing. She looked nervous while standing near the doorway holding her purse awkwardly. Daniel wouldn't even look directly at me. The silence inside the apartment felt unbearable. At first, I honestly thought maybe there was some explanation. Maybe they had come from work together unexpectedly. So despite the uncomfortable feeling rising in my chest, I forced myself to smile politely. "Hi," I said quietly. Vanessa gave me a small nervous smile. And then Daniel finally spoke. "Vanessa is going to stay with us for a while." I remember blinking at him slowly because the sentence sounded so ridiculous that my brain struggled to understand it. "What?" I said. He rubbed his forehead tiredly before speaking again. "She lost her apartment recently, and she needs somewhere temporary to stay." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "You want your girlfriend to live with us?" Daniel sighed heavily like I was the one making things difficult. "She's not my girlfriend," he said. I laughed bitterly. "Do you honestly hear yourself right now?" The room became painfully quiet. Then Daniel said the words that completely shattered whatever remained in our marriage. "I think I'm in love with her." I looked at the man I loved for years and realized I no longer recognized him at all. Vanessa started crying softly and whispered, "Maybe I should leave." "Yes," I said immediately while staring at Daniel. "She should." But Daniel defended her. "Not me but her." And honestly that hurt more than the cheating itself. Because in that moment, I realized he had already emotionally left our marriage long before I discovered the truth. That night turned into the worst argument of my life. Years of pain, disappointment, loneliness, and betrayal exploded all at once. I cried harder than I ever had before. Daniel stood there looking emotionally exhausted instead of guilty. At tone point I remember asking him the question that had been destroying me for months. "When did you stop loving me?" And the saddest part is that he couldn't answer. Vanessa left the apartment that night, but honestly the damage had already been done. 2 weeks later Daniel moved out completely. And just like that, the life I spent years building disappeared overnight. The month after our separation was horrible. I stopped eating properly. I cried randomly at work. I avoided friends because I hated repeating the story over and over again while watching pity fill their faces. The hardest part wasn't even losing my husband. It was losing the future I thought I was going to have. Sometimes heartbreak isn't only about the person. Sometimes it is about the dreams connected to them. But slowly things became easier. I started going on long walks again. I reconnected with old friends. I spent less time blaming myself for Daniel's choices and more time rebuilding the parts of myself I had neglected during our marriage. Then one evening, almost 7 months after our separation, Sophie looked at me during dinner and smiled softly. "You look lighter." And for the first time in a very long time, I realized she was right.